I started my career here in Dublin as a fashion designer 25 more years ago. And I think what's really interesting about coming out of a really traditional craft-based design discipline is that I really learned about the kind of cultural significance of design through designing clothing. And I really liked this idea that we don't design for how we are, but how we wish to be. And I think that aspirational nature and the kind of qualities of aspiring to be something is so inherent to the design principles that we all use, and I think it's why design fits so neatly into the area of innovation. And I've been lucky to have a career in innovation, primarily because I think this idea of design is very much about thinking about the future, but in a very optimistic and kind of aspirational way. So as I said, I started out making clothing, did a lot of knitwear, was kind of, again, really committed to the craft of making, hand-making things. Became quite frustrated with the kind of feeling that I didn't have enough skills to really function in kind of comprehensively in an industry and running a business. And so I went back to what I say school. I mean, I went back to college. I ended up at the Royal College of Art in London. And I applied for a program which was called Design Management. And I thought, oh, I'm going to become a business person and learn all about the business of design. And they called me and said, you know that program that you applied for, we just canceled it because no one else applied. And I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. So no one wanted to do design management. This was in the very early 90s. And so they said, we are starting this other program. We're trying to recruit into it. It's kind of really early, part of the industrial design. And it's looking at kind of computer-related design and interaction design. So I ended up doing that program kind of reluctantly because it felt like it wasn't what I was kind of a real fit, but I ended up getting really involved in kind of my career launched out of that in wearables in the early 90s. And so many of you who maybe weren't alive in the early 90s may not realize this, but there's just been waves and waves of people who've worked in the kind of arena of the kind of wearable technology. And a lot was happening in the 90s, particularly at MIT Media Lab. And so again, I was really lucky that I had come from this traditional design background. I had kind of added this kind of complement of technology. It had kind of morphed into this career around wearables, and I ended up doing a lot of really interesting work, one of which was at a research company in Palo Alto in Silicon Valley, again, early 90s. We ran this really extensive project about the kind of integration of kind of technical aspects and components into clothing. And it was really interesting. It was at that time, the project was called Jacquard. Again, it was after the Jacquard loom, making the kind of reference and the homage back to the original computer and the kind of loom weaving. I worked at Motorola and did a lot of wearables for them as well. That was kind of mid-90s, or maybe a little bit later. 2001 was when we showed a lot of this stuff. And what's interesting is that I look now, and recently Google and Levi have started a program about integration of electronic components into clothing and textiles, and they've actually called it the same name. And it's really interesting, and what that teaches you about innovation is it's all about timing. It's not about good ideas. It's exactly the same work. I mean, it's almost identical. It's just about timing. And so working in innovation, you can feel like your ideas are really good, and you can feel like you don't understand why they didn't get any traction. It's so much about context and about timing. So working in the area of wearables, I got an opportunity to work for the Department of Defense in the States, and this was kind of a really compelling arena to work in and a community to work with. I went to work with them, and the primary user community that we had at that time was Special Operations and Navy SEALs. And so they're the most elite group of kind of soldiers that they have, and they're the ones they typically design the kind of high-tech equipment for. And we used to go to meetings, they're called developer meetings, and it's a bit like industries are getting together, and they're talking to each other, and they're talking about the future. And they're trying to figure out, what do we need to work on now so we can be ready for the future. And there was always a presentation. It was typically a keynote. It would be someone who was a really senior, like general in the army, would be brought in, and he would paint a picture of what the future of warfare and the future of defense was going to need to be like. And we call this the burning baby slide. And what's kind of weird about the burning baby slide, well, there's lots of weird things about it, but what's really weird about it is that this was at a point where there was no image that existed to represent the vision of what was going to happen in the future for this industry, for this developer group. There was no way of showing a picture and saying, we're going to fight these kind of wars, we're going to fight these kind of battles, we need this kind of equipment. So they would use clip art, and they'd have a tank, so they wanted to make the reference to urban. They felt like warfare was going to become more and more urban. There was going to be, the baby represented the innocent bystander, what's called a non-combatant. The baby on fire represented that person, being kind of collateral damage. And this was this really surreal image that frequently kind of came, and they would put things like arrows, and they'd say, and then this will happen, and then the tank will come, and this will be this apocalyptic. And quite frankly, this was sounding facetious, but it was almost humorous because it seemed so impossible. And it also seemed like they were talking about fiction. And then this happened. And then this happened. And so it is not hard to find pictures of exactly what they were talking about. And it took 5 years. And so I guess the big takeaway for me, having worked in innovation, is that it's not always about things getting better. It really struck me, it was really interesting. I kind of reflected on what happens when you work in innovation and you start to see some things work and some things get traction and some things happen really quickly, and why. And it's not always because things are getting better. So let's talk a little bit about healthcare. Possibly because I had worked in that arena for a while, I pivoted and thought, okay, where would be a slightly healthier place to work? And I really started to focus on wanting to work in healthcare, and so wanting to bring the power and the kind of lens of design into the healthcare arena. I spent, from 2001 to 2009, I was teaching at a design school, I was doing a lot of projects with different hospitals. It was really hard to crack into healthcare. So from a design perspective, and again, to all of you, anyone who's kind of starting in a career or midway through, persisting, like figuring out what you want to do with your career, often you can't just make it happen, you have to really persist. So I kind of picked away at the edges of trying to be established in healthcare, and it's really hard if you're not a scientist or a medical profession to work in healthcare. I was at the MIT Media Lab, and I ran a group there looking at well-being, because they said, don't call it healthcare because you're not clinically qualified. Eventually, I got to work at the Mayo Clinic. I kind of built up enough reputation, I think, working at the edges of the industry, and I think it's something that you often have to do, particularly from a design perspective. You don't naturally qualify. You're not the kind of native to many of these industries, so you have to really work at the edges and work your way in. This is Mayo Clinic. It's a remarkable place. I wish I had more time. What's interesting from an innovation perspective is that you kind of come into Mayo and your job is to change things and to innovate. And one thing I noticed was I was looking at the environment, and I thought, okay, so something about this place is telling me they don't like change. There's not a lot of, so there's like these cues that are in the environment that are saying we have ritualized this industry, we have ritualized this organization, this space is hallowed, it is just this kind of, it's a mecca of healthcare, but we're terrified to change it. And so it was really, really interesting thinking about what's my job going to be in terms of finding the most appropriate way to actually kind of think about how you change a space like this. And from a design perspective, the built environment is really important because it reflects the rituals that are reinforced every day. And so you see those triggers. Patients come in and they know the cues of like, how do I behave as a patient? And the clinical staff behave a certain way. Working in healthcare is pretty grim in the beginning. It's a lot of like looking away, which is interesting because you kind of, again, you work so hard to get into it, and then it's just like this really difficult environment. But there's a lot of, I think the term brutality is a tough term to use, but there's a lot of kind of brutality in healthcare. It's really important, and it's a really legitimate, remarkable place to work, but it's terrifying for most people. This was something that a patient had said about their experience, and this is, again, a dangerous thing for me to say from a perspective of inside an organization, but they meant it as a compliment. They were trying to describe what happens. They had been in a really bad car accident and had spent a long time recovering, and they were really kind of able to reflect in a very thoughtful way and said, I get it, you guys are amazing. I would never have survived at Mayo Clinic, but what you did to me to keep me alive, almost killed me. People fear the consequence of illness more than illness itself. There's so much stigma. We've discovered so much, and particularly, I don't know how, maybe it's true in Europe and here in Ireland, but in the States, it's really isolating to be diseased. It really marginalizes you. It changes your identity. It pushes you to the edge of society. It's a really isolating experience. As a consequence, people tend to often not acknowledge their diseases because it has huge implications. We think about, for patients, the journey is important as the destination. It's really important what happens then through that disease state. I'm going really fast because I'm running out of time. Patients have extreme and extraordinary preferences. This was something that was said to me again when I worked for the Department of Defense. I had this meeting with this, he was a spec ops guy, and he was really frustrated that he had to talk to a designer, and particularly a woman. This was not part of the job description. And he was like, okay, ma'am, you've got to understand that. And I was asking him about his equipment, and he said, the thing you have to understand is we have extreme and extraordinary preferences. And he kind of was pissed at me, and he said, we don't care about the same things that most people care about, but we care about things that other people don't care about. So we have, you give us a piece of equipment, if it has a heat signature, that's going to expose us. So we have these really unusual needs. And I remembered that, and when I came into healthcare, I started to understand that the patient population was exactly the same. They have really extreme and kind of extraordinary needs. Patients don't know what they don't know. This is, again, could be a long story, I'll make it short. I was observing a woman, her husband had just had a diagnosis. He had an inoperable brain tumor, and the surgeon was sitting in the room, had just told him the results. The surgeon said, do you have any questions? And the husband was very quiet. And the wife asked a couple of questions, and then she was also very quiet. And then she said, what questions should I ask that I don't know to ask? And this idea that she knew that this surgeon knew everything, and she knew that she knew nothing, and she didn't know how to find out. And so we talk about information inequity, knowledge inequity in healthcare, and really trying to figure. So we do a lot of work about kind of equalizing that. This is the healthcare system, right? I don't know how it is here. This is what it feels like in the States. And so again, our job from a design perspective is we pay attention, we often talk about, it's kind of simple, it's just watch what people are doing. Good design is watching what people are doing, because people are really smart, and they're way smarter than the system, and they're going to figure out the most efficient way to move through a system. And there's an expression, deviant behavior, and sometimes it's used generally around patients when they're not doing what you want them to do. And then this deviant behavior actually is a real gift. It's an opportunity to look at how that person's using a system, and they found massive efficiencies. So we do a lot of looking at how people use the system. We create a lot of maps. We talk about this idea of making the invisible visible in systems, so really trying to show the practice itself, what's happening and how people are using the system. So again, from a design perspective, the reason we're valued at Mayo is that we can make a lot of things really visual. So we can kind of make things tangible so people can make very different decisions about them because they become really objective. People collaborate in spite of tools they're given, not because of them. I wanted to kind of end on a kind of tech note because I think a lot of, maybe generally there's a conversation around the role of technology in healthcare, and most tech companies are kind of stepping up and saying, we can fix it. We're technologies, we're going to fix everything with technology. And it's really kind of, the healthcare industry is kind of hesitating about the relationships that they should have with technologies and where they should put tools. And what's most important about tools in this very elaborate system is that, people currently are working despite them. They're not very good tools. What we need is technology to do not so much what it can do, but what you don't have to do. There is such a burden on the people who are working in this industry right now that every time you introduce a new tool, you have to think about what don't they have to do. I'm going to skip that because I'm running out of time. We've been looking a lot at kind of, again, introducing new novel technologies. We have a lot of companies coming to Mayo and asking to test their technology. We're recently doing stuff with Google. Again, very conservative about what we might do with that. What's really interesting is we ran an experiment where we centralized a lot of the expertise. This is an eICU, which is an electronic ICU. We have a lot of remote rural hospitals. We have all the kind of centralized knowledge in one place, which is the top left picture. And then these smaller hospitals would have this kind of telemedicine with the kind of consultants. What we discovered is the further away that these consultants got from patients, the more data they needed to make decisions. And so they were calling for new labs and more images, and they were calling for more recent kind of workups on the patients because you had abstracted them away from the traditional way they practice medicine and you had isolated them. And because of that, you drove up their appetite for data. And so you started to move, you created an efficiency in one place and you drove up costs somewhere else and complexity. I'm going to end on this topic or this idea. I think in general, with design, in conversations around innovation and conversations about technology is that it's really about kind of amplifying the voice of the end user and making sure that whatever happens in innovation, that we hold ourselves accountable for the kind of innocent bystanders. And that's it. Thank you.
Want to be in the audience next time? Click here for tickets to Inspirefest 2017.